Good morning, Nathan.
Amy, how you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
It's been a busy year so far, of course, with the legislative session just coming out, but it's been really wonderful to watch a lot of the reaction that's taking place in the state of Wyoming. So it's been busy, but very good.
Well, most importantly, I hope you've gotten a little bit of rest.
Oh, well, it seems like after a legislative session, I remember this both when I was a legislator and then having corresponded just recently with a number of people as they've returned home. I know that for many people, a big pile of work is stacked up. And so you just change hats and go after it in a different way.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's just get in this. Let's get dug in. Let's do a really good recap of what you saw during the 2023 legislative session. So I wanted to start by asking you, what do you think were the top three, probably the most encouraging things that you saw happen this legislative session?
Well, that's a really good question. Because many times in the swirl of things, it's more difficult to really think through how did everything go. But I saw a lot more engagement this year from people who are working through our network, Wyoming Family Alliance. And as a result of that, in many ways, because of them and because of being down there so much, we had a really good presence there. As a result, for instance, the Life is a Human Rights Act, which was this year, it was called HB 152, that really had an opportunity to come through the process. And so we watched a number of people work together. And that's our hope as we build out an alliance across the state. It isn't just one person or even two or three individuals. It's an alliance. It's an opportunity for people to work together. And that's been really good. One of the other things I was really thankful for is how the doors were opened for us to work as Wyoming Family Alliance as a synapse, if you will, connecting, for instance, the House to the Senate, and then discussing things with the 5 statewide electeds, and then corresponding then out to the grassroots. This is something Wyoming's needed for quite some time, and there's not really very many other groups like this, especially in the state of Wyoming. And so the ability to correspond in that way, function as a synapse, has been very good. One other thing, I think before we jump off of this question, and I may be stealing some of your thunder, so forgive me that, and we can rephrase later, but we had a couple of really wonderful victories in education policy this year. And one of those was a very simple, thoughtful bill brought by House Majority Floor Leader Chip Nyman, House Bill 70. It was just called home-based education. And that makes a lot of sense. Before that, let me give you a scenario so we can explain the bill. If you had a ranch that's very, very distant from other schools, but you had two families that were living fairly close together, and they had children and they wanted to homeschool those children. Prior to this bill, there was a question out there as to whether if one mom dropped some of her children off with another mom, so that they could actually learn something that other mom was very, very skilled in, and they shared some of those duties. There was a question as to whether that was legal or not. So this was a very thoughtful way to approach that legislation, and it passed overwhelmingly. Secondly was House Bill 174. Actually, I believe that was a Senate file, but it was a charter school bill that allows for good, thoughtful legislation that brings about an authorizer. And so this was a very important thing. By the way, before we get off the subject of education, there was a bill that protected, it was a qualified victory, I have to be honest, but it did further the efforts that we're fighting for to protect the promise of Title IX as we protect the opportunity for Wyoming girls to play on a fair playing field against other girls and potentially win scholarships for college. And so in many places, it's been called either Save Girls Sports or Fairness in Women's Sports. But this was a very important effort, and it's been successful so far.
Well, it's exciting to hear that there were some victories going forward, and some good ones. As you said, maybe a few qualified, but still, every time we move the ball down the field, it's a victory.
Amy, also, we have to say some of those, as we're recording this, some of those are still sitting on the governor's desk. We anticipate that they will be signed, but we would ask people to continue to pray and call and work the way that they did during this last legislative session, I think is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Hate to do it, but let's move off of the encouraging things, as encouraged as they were. What do you think were some of the more discouraging things you saw this legislative session? And maybe as a follow-up, keeping in mind those discouragements, what we can do about them.
That's a very good question. And let me just step back and say, I think most anyone can see over the last number of years that politics across the nation have gotten more divisive in a number of ways. Of course, the pressure on the family has grown more than ever before, and we've seen that over the last decade for sure. And so there's no doubt about it, but that the people of Wyoming have to understand that national politics have arrived at our doorstep. And I think most people are aware of that. And that's where Wyoming Family Alliance, our desire, our efforts is to stay focused on the issues rather than getting personality driven. The issues that we're talking about here are big issues that go beyond time and space, that go beyond the generational questions, or the questions of one generation to the questions that go from generation to generation. What does it mean to be a man or a woman? Is that a biological reality? Or is that something that someone can just assume for themselves, depending on how they feel, or whether they want to compete on a less challenging, for instance, playing field or swim or whatever it may be, if they want to compete in a different way? These are big questions. And so we at Wyoming Family Alliance want to focus on those big issues, remaining, if you will, above the personality fray and stay on the bigger, more important questions. And because those big important questions are ones that will matter from here and all the way through.
So speaking of, the divisiveness in our politics, what do you see in terms of information that flows to legislators and how Wyoming Family Alliance can have a role in that?
That's a good question. That's a really good question because we've had the opportunity to really see something this year. The amount of misinformation that continues to be used in the state of Wyoming, that across the nation has been falsified over and over again, oftentimes comes back through the state of Wyoming because we haven't had anybody that really can do the deep research. For instance, when it comes to parental rights and education, many times you'll find individuals that represent, for instance, unions and other things that will come and throw accusations against educational freedom. And they have been falsified over and over in other states. And so what we have the opportunity to do at Wyoming Family Alliance, because we have a very good research department, is we can turn focused attention on providing that gold level standard of information that Wyoming has needed for a very long time. And as we continue to grow that, we have the opportunity to move Wyoming in the direction of freedom. And that's our ultimate aim here.
Wonderful. So looking at sort of the news that we saw coming out of the session, I think just to address this, because I know a lot of the followers of Wyoming Family Alliance, obviously they read and have seen some of the news coming out. I would love to get your take. Folks, there were some folks saying, this year's leadership were sort of out of control in ways we haven't seen in the past, in terms of, putting bills in drawers and things like that. Give me your perspective. Obviously, you've served. Give me your perspective on what you thought in terms of leadership, and how that may have affected bills as they move through the process.
Well, I'd have to say, in my exposure to the legislature, which now goes back more than a decade, and you were in the legislature as well years ago, we have seen probably one of the most difficult years we've ever seen. People putting bills in drawers and killing bills on general file, using substitute bills to completely rewrite legislation. That some of that was in some ways unprecedented. I'm not saying that, for instance, substitute bills haven't been used before, but this was a very unique use of that this year. And so one thing I want to point out, though, is a positive example. The Senate had, of course, as many divisions as any other Senate has ever had, but leadership this year, even when they disagreed with things, were very thoughtful about allowing the debate to continue. And I think they did a great job. And so rather than highlight just the negative, one thing we can say is that when we watched the Senate and the House this year, the Senate did a wonderful job of thoroughly debating a lot of legislation, and I really want to commend them for that.
Wonderful. We have at Wyoming Family Alliance, you have a principle that I think is really important to you, and I wanted to ask you about it because I think it speaks a lot to the process that you go through in terms of looking at bills as they come up. You believe very strongly that as you go through the decision-making factors on bills, is that you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Why is this an important principle for Wyoming Family Alliance and also just for Christians in general as they look at politics?
Well, that's a very deep question. It's a very good question. And obviously we always are striving for the ideal. But oftentimes in the clash of ideals, we find individuals that grow in the realm of statesmanship. And statesmanship is something that isn't often talked about. It's certainly not talked about enough in our culture today. And that is an individual that will think with solid philosophy, that actually understands solid philosophy, that actually will study it and then use wisdom, using wisdom from the Holy Spirit, from the Bible, from an understanding of natural law. That kind of statesmanship is so important. And by the way, let me say something real quick here. I do take, as you know, graduate classes, and I had a professor recently talk about this, and I thought it was so intriguing. He talked about what wisdom looks like. So, for instance, the scriptures address the subject of wisdom. There was a very wise king by the name of Solomon that said that, and he was encouraging people to go get wisdom. Then the question is, how do you get wisdom? And then he says, well, go get it. And then, well, thank you very much. We want to go get it, but how do you get it? Well, just go get it. And I think one thing that you can see in that interaction is that it is the pursuit of wisdom, is in studying everything you possibly can about the subject of wisdom, that wisdom is actually found. It takes someone who's willing to pursue it. And so when we see that in a person, and we see that person get involved in public policy, that is where you really see the development of statesmanship. And one of the things that we do every year at our Statesman Academy, this is a national group, a national opportunity that we allow people from the state of Wyoming. We recommend individuals to go to these at the national level. We have Dr. Matthew Spalding every year come from the graduate program at Hillsdale College. Dr. Matthew Spalding talks about the subject of prudence, specifically in the life of Abraham Lincoln. It is one of the most wonderful talks. I've listened to it several times, and what I want to do is just, if I could, download the whole thing into my brain so I could just recite it over and over again. But prudence is the application of wisdom, and that's what our culture needs now. We do live in times of darkness and unwise thought. And many times you'll find very confused people. In the most foundational thing, how we see ourselves as human beings, for instance, has become a confused topic. And what we need now are people who are wise, who will think with prudence and continue moving freedom forward. And that's really what we have the opportunity to do here at Wyoming Family Alliance.
Wonderful. I think you may have just added something to the list on my next question to you, which will be wisdom. But the question is, what should Christians in Wyoming should be praying for in this near future for the state?
Well, that's a good question. We need to pray for the spirit of wisdom.
Yeah.
I think first for ourselves. For every Christian in this state, we need to be in pursuit of wisdom. And that means actually studying from where wisdom is found, from studying the scriptures, from understanding how previous generations, and I'm so thankful for people in the past who really pursued this. And so I'll throw out a few names here. I have had a growing love for studying out the life and the writings of a man by the name of Tertullian. in early church history, and Augustine of Hippo. And then, of course, we have Thomas Aquinas, a very, very brilliant man. That's the study of Thomism. But as we look even as our founding fathers in the understanding of the application of wisdom, and most people don't really study this out, these are men that were very studious in the realm of the Scottish school of common sense philosophy. And so when you look at how they applied wisdom to the founding of this country, we as citizens, as Christians in the state of Wyoming, need to go back through these well-trodden paths and understand wisdom and apply it in our own lives. And so that should be a prayer for ourselves. But secondly, I think we need to pray for wisdom for our leaders. And that's very important. Many of our leaders, they also too are working day-to-day jobs. So they'll come down to Cheyenne and they'll focus in on issues, and then they go back home and they have to make sure that the farm is going well, that the ranch is going well, that their businesses where they're selling things is going well. And so we need to pray for them as individuals. Amy, I think I should say this as well. Many times we turn people who are elected to public office, we somehow diminish their humanity, and then we turn them into objects. We turn the human being into their office. And that's something we shouldn't do in Wyoming. I'll never forget when I was in the legislature, I had a gentleman that was my next door neighbor. His name was Randy, and he was able just to talk right over his fence. I don't know if you used to watch the old 1990s sitcom with Tim the Toolman Taylor. I think it was called Home Improvement. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
I forget the guy's name. You never saw all of his face, but he would poke just his eyeballs over the fence, and he would have this conversation. That happens in Wyoming with our elected representatives. And I think if we would just remember that these are people and have a conversation with them, it would be so helpful for ourselves and for them. And we have that privilege. We should take advantage of it here. And so always make sure that you treat those individuals you've elected to represent you, turn them into human beings and establish a relationship with them. And that matters very much.
Yes, good. Wonderful. That's a good list for Christians for us to be praying. Last question, and then I'm going to let you go because I know you are super busy, Nathan, and you need to get back to stuff. Thanks for taking the time to speak to us here. What is the most important culture war you think we're facing here in Wyoming, and what are our paths to victory?
Wow. Okay. I love this question. So obviously, the give and take of any sort of question and answer session, you kind of anticipating what is a person going to ask. But I'll tell you with this one, that's an easy answer. Oh. What Wyoming needs to really begin to engage is how we need to understand the role of parents and families in the education of their own children. According to the Parent Power Index, which a person can find online, according to that index, just about 4 years ago, Wyoming was 50th in the nation in educational freedom. 50th. 3 years ago, there was some legislation that passed that allowed for only three charter schools to be founded in the state of Wyoming. Now, that bumped us from 50th to 47th. There was another charter school bill, and I'm very thankful for the legislative win this year, but really that just keeps us in that 47th position, I think. So far, we have a lot of work ahead of us in establishing educational freedom. All around us over the last 2 months, we have watched in Utah, we've watched in Iowa. Last year we saw in Arizona, and then over in West Virginia and in Florida. And I'm just only hitting probably a quarter of the states that have begun the process of empowering parents in the education of their children. And I think Wyoming needs to step in and say, okay, listen, we've started to turn up dead last in this because of the pressure of unions and the centralization of the educational structure in Wyoming. We need to step up and say, no, Wyoming is going to establish freedom, educational freedom, as the gold standard. And we're going to begin the long process of moving educational freedom forward in this state. And that really is, I think, the most important culture war culture engagement that we're going to see moving forward over the next several years.
No, I think that's exactly right, Nathan. And I have to say, I'm excited as someone who supported school choice for quite a while. I'm excited to see where that battle is going. I think there's a great future ahead for Wyoming, and it is exciting. I know I promised I was going to have that be our last question. I got one more for you. I think it's a good follow-up to what you just talked about.
That's
You know,
great.
in discussions around school choice, we're often led to believe that it's a battle between our public schools and supporting our public schools and parental rights. Explain why that is absolutely a false dichotomy.
I love that question. I love that question because that is often how the conversation is framed. And it's nothing could be further from the truth. Let me just say this, two things can be true at the same time. We can have strong, robust public schools, and we can have great homeschools and private schools and Christian schools across the state of Wyoming. What we need and what America was built upon was the idea of having choice. And so what we need are choices in education. I think anyone can recognize, even among your own children, I know this is true of my children, that every one of them is unique. So they have unique needs. Families are unique. And so if they have the opportunity, instead of being locked into just one form of education in one kind of scenario, if they are given more choices, that can do nothing but strengthen the family. And as a result of strengthening the family, it will strengthen the state of Wyoming. And that's why we want to advocate so very hard for parental rights in education and for educational freedom.
Yes, absolutely. And let's not forget, Nathan, that as we fight for those strengths and we see that every child learns differently, every teacher is different. As we grow this school choice market in the state of Wyoming, teachers who may not always thrive in the public school setting can thrive in other settings. So it's exciting.
I'm so glad that you brought that up because as we have been pushing for this, what I've noted is there are a number of public school teachers that have reached out and are very, very encouraged about the idea of educational freedom. And so I think there is an establishment, if you will, more elites kind of at the top that really don't want any changes to come in, but many other people that are engaged both in public education and then in private education and other places, they're very excited about the idea of seeing educational freedom.
Wonderful. Good stuff. All right. We will leave it there. I know you've got to get back and got a ton of work to get to. Thank you so much, Nathan. This is our first podcast. I know you and I have great hopes for the future and maybe some exciting guests to come. So great to visit with you, Nathan.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's great to see you again.